Lynn? Lynn, do you want to be Lynn again?
We'll call the meeting to order. This is a Lakewood Planning Commission meeting, Wednesday, May 15th, 2024. Welcome all those visitors with us tonight. Go ahead and do roll call, Ms. Devereaux.
Ellen Talbot,
Present.
Philip Lindholm,
Present.
Mark Air,
Present.
Lynn Larson. Sharon Wallace is excused. Robert Estrada,
Excused at this time.
okay.
We're not sure if he'll be here.
Philip Combs,
Present.
you have quorum.
Thank you. Everyone's had a chance to review the meeting minutes that were distributed. Are there any changes that need to be made? Any edits? Any room?
Move for approval.
Second that.
So that's Mr. Larson is first and Mr. Lindholm is second. So approved.
Need to take a vote for approval.
Oh, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? It's unanimous. All right, well, let's go ahead and turn the time over to Ms. Spear. Anything there, or should we run through the agenda?
If you wouldn't mind going down to the agenda, then we'll get to the new business.
Let's go ahead and open up for what, any updates to the agenda that you saw? No? All right, we'll move forward then. We'll open it up for public comment.
And no one here for public comment tonight.
All right. We'll go ahead and close the public comment, and there's no unfinished business to proceed with, so we'll go ahead and start into our new business. Ms. Spear, I'll turn the time over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So first, I need to just thank you for your patience as we move through this process for the 24 comp plan amendment. Right now, we're in this really quick turn on a dime period where we're getting information and providing that to you and also preparing it for public hearing. And it's asking a lot of you. There's a lot of pages involved at this point. So thank you for your work that you're doing. And as you get ready for the public hearing this next meeting, again, thank you. What I'm going to do tonight is walk through the regulatory side of the proposed amendments as they stand tonight. I will tell you that there are some additional changes that I anticipate bringing to you before the public hearing on June 5th. But we'll walk through most of it tonight, probably 85% of what you're going to see come June 5th. And then we're also going to touch base a little bit on some information that came out of the biennial reviews of the downtown and the station district subareas because they relate as well to the 24 process. So with that, in your packet tonight, you had an older version of the development regulations. And again, you'll get the updated version here shortly, but that will be familiar with much of what I give you tonight. If there is something in what I talk about that you haven't seen yet, you will see it in hard copy, but feel free to stop me for clarification if you need it. But what I will do now is share screen. And pardon me while I get some controls out of the way. Oh, I am so sorry, Mr. Chair. I apologize. We actually have REMAC on your screen as the guest that's here tonight. Mr. REMAC is the new Community and Economic Development Department Director. And so Chair Estrada invited him to come tonight and introduce himself. That's why he's here. So if you would like to have him unmute and talk, introduce himself, whatever you'd like, you're welcome to ask him to do so.
Yeah, Mr. Remack, could you take a few minutes to just introduce yourself to the commission?
Certainly. Tiffany, I think my video is blocked right now in terms of being able to turn it on.
Okay, I'll try to fix that.
No problem. My name is Jeff Remack. Pleasure to meet you. Been with Lakewood now for about a month and a half, coming from the county of Kitsap. Was there for 23 years, 15 in the last community development. Last 5 of that was working as their director for community development. Hi, it's nice to meet you. Appreciate the opportunity to come to the city of Lakewood and bring some of the experience I have there and do great things really in what we're looking at in terms of economic development and growth that people are looking for in the city of Lakewood. That was one of the big things that attracted me to Lakewood, as well as its tie to the military. You know, you see all the flags that are behind you. I'm 27 years now into the Navy Reserve. Still cranking away, maybe another 3 and I'll probably be done. But with that ending, I did want to find somewhere that I could still continue to serve that community. And Lakewood was really that home that I found. So appreciate getting to meet all of you, and it should participate with the planning commission and listen to the going ons.
Thank you very much. We look forward to working with you.
Thanks.
All right, thanks again. Apologies for the misstep there. So I will now go ahead and start my sharing. I'll do this one more time. One moment, please. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and go through a few of the things that were talked about at the last meeting, but again, for purposes of the record, just making this clear for anyone who may watch this after the fact. The 24 Comprehensive Plan Periodic Review is required by the Growth Management Act as something that happens every 10 years for the city of Lakewood. We are on a schedule to be complete by December 31st, 2024 under the Growth Management Act. And then in the future, there will be what are called an implementation progress report due at the 5-year time between the 10-year periodic reviews. So once this process finishes up this year, there will be this new implementation progress report due in 2029. In terms of the process, we've gone as far as the star on this graphic so far. There's been the public engagement in a number of different ways since September of 22. There's been drafting of language, some of which we'll be talking about tonight. There's a pending supplemental environmental impact statement for the comprehensive plan, which will also be going through its SEPA review concurrent with what we're doing here at the city for the plan itself and the development regulations. And then by September, the city council is scheduled to take action on approving the 10-year changes to the plan and the regulations. And then it goes to the Puget Sound Regional Council for certification for consistency, particularly related to transportation. And it will also go to the Department of Commerce for acceptance, to put it in a different, it's not quite the certification process, but they need to review it as well. What are we talking about tonight? We're going to go at a high level, but please do stop me if you have a specific question, or if you like the pace at which I'm going, then we can just have an easy back and forth dialogue about what's been proposed. We do have tonight with us Andrew Bjorn. He is the lead person from Burke Consulting, who's been our partner in this effort since 22. So he will be able to answer perhaps some of the questions that I won't be able to on some of the details you may have questions about. And then we're also going to talk about a couple of things that are tangential to, but related to the 24 10-year process. One of which are the amendments that were first proposed last year related to short-term rentals in the city. Some of you were here for that, but most of you weren't. There was a discussion last year where the city came to the Planning Commission and said, given the fact that in this 24 process, there's going to be the potential for significantly more accessory dwelling units in the city staff made the recommendation to actually prohibit the use of ADUs as short-term rentals. There was a mixed reaction and recommendation that came from the Planning Commission to the council about that. It passed as a recommendation to not prohibit that, but there were differing opinions at the time. The city council received that. They also talked about it themselves, and by the end of their deliberations, did not take any action at all on what the Planning Commission had sent forward. Instead, they brought it back to you to say, as part of this process this year, give us a new recommendation. And so that's what we're going to talk about a little bit tonight. There's also a requirement that was passed by the state legislature that we need to update some of how our public noticing is done. So it's a drier topic, if you will, but it's something we need to do. Then we've got, as I mentioned before, the biennial reviews of our two big sub areas, downtown and Station District. There are a few regulatory amendments that are recommended as a result of those reviews, and so we'll go over those tonight as well. So any questions on that before I start in? All right. So the Critical Areas Ordinance, which is Lakewood Municipal Code Title 14, there's a lot of specific edits within the chapter, as you saw in the information provided to you between the last two meetings. But in essence, it's updating to comply with state law that's changed since the last time this ordinance was amended in the city. For wetlands in particular, geologically hazardous areas, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, priority habitat and species management techniques and recommendations that are coming from the state agencies. Also updating the critical species listings. What are they? And there's reference here to where the city is being referred to get those updated pieces of information. And then there's also one that is related to critical area monitoring and adaptive management. So all of these things at this point are in the draft. I will tell you that some of this is being talked about internally within the city, looking at what the consultants have put together for us, and we are potentially going to be coming back to you with a different version of this by June 5th. I can't tell you exactly what might change, but there may be some tweaks to what's been proposed by our consultant. But just pausing here, is there any questions or did you have any thoughts on the critical area amendments by chance for tonight? If not, that's perfectly fine. We're going to have plenty of options for you guys to discuss. Okay. Related to the critical areas ordinance, and one thing that Director Remack and myself have been talking about for the last week or so, we adopted the Shoreline Master Program here in the city of Lakewood in 2019. And per state law, it is also on a 10-year review cycle, meaning the next time it's scheduled for an update would be 2029. However, Lakewood has a setup in its regulations where the critical areas ordinance talks about the Shoreline Master Program and vice versa. And by not touching this Shoreline Master Program, we run the risk of having some inconsistent content and also maybe some outdated cross-referencing. So we're in the middle of trying to figure out how to address that without having to open up 5 years early the entire Shoreline Master Program, because that is a significant effort. So more to come on this. We're meeting within the next week with several other agency experts with the Department of Ecology, as well as talking to some third parties about how to do this in the most efficient way if we actually do have to deal with the SMP. So more to come, but because of the relationship between these two parts of our regulatory scheme in Lakewood, we're having to look at both, which is not strictly part of the 10-year comprehensive plan update. Other than that, getting into the actual language of Title 18, the citywide development regulations. Title 18A is outside of the sub-area plans, and then what parts the sub-area code doesn't cover, the citywide stuff comes in as the default. But in this case, we're talking basic provisions, Chapter 18A10. Long story short, replacing the designation single family with the new residential designation. And what that is doing is taking away the classification of some of those areas, particularly around the lakes, and where there may be other environmental restrictions that lower density as a result, combining them into the same umbrella with the R1, 2, 3, 4 zones all being together. And then couple that with the creation of a new designation or new number of zones that are close to the transit, that major transit stop discussion that we've been having. So if it is a residential lot that's within half a mile of a major transit stop, it's going to be treated and regulated a little bit differently, and what's allowed on it is a little bit different as well. Excuse me. Within the residential 1 through 4 zones, there are the changes we've talked about quite a bit. That should be 1220. That is the affordable to all economic segments of our population, a certain number of units. That's also looking at racial disparity and trying to turn away from that if that's been a historical result of land use regulations or economic development work in the city. 1110 is the one that says middle housing, multiple units on a residential lot. And 1337 is the accessory dwelling unit bill.
Ms. Spear,
Yes.
we have a question by,
I'd like to know the basis for the half-mile regulation, or if it's, is it a regulation, or is it a suggestion, or a guideline, or what? Seems to me like we have a broader reach than just a half mile from the transit station for increased density of housing.
The 1/2 mile comes directly out of state law changes that the legislature adopted over the last 2 and 3 sessions.
Okay.
And the idea there is we're going to densify everywhere, but closer into where you potentially or theoretically are walking or biking to a transit asset, you're going to need either less parking or you should have more density to maximize use of that land around that transit.
Got it. Thank you.
Sure. Then in Lakewood, you know this as well, but we have the air corridor zones immediately to the north of the North McCord field on Joint Base Lewis McCord, where because of safety issues, the city has restricted the types of uses and the number of people per acre can occupy or work at the area in that zone based on Department of Defense and FAA safety guidelines. What we have, though, is that there's been a little mishmash of terms over time in code, and so we're clarifying accident potential zones versus air corridor zones. Just in summary, the air corridor zone, that is the actual name of the land use zone. Accident potential zone, that comes straight out of the military guidance, and so we're just making sure it's all clear in code. Not other than that, really not a lot of substantive change there. Then the way we're dealing with the idea that we were just talking about of what happens within a half mile of a major transit stop, rather than creating a new zone per se, it's being handled in an overlay. So first of all, any questions about what an overlay is? Just in general land use terms. You have, let me just put it out there for anybody who doesn't want to admit they want to know this. You have a map and you have zones that say this is going to be residential, this is going to be commercial, here's your industrial, here's your park. But within any of those areas, you can also put a quote overlay on some or all of that particular spot to say, these other rules also apply in this situation, or we may exempt certain uses from something if it's within this overlay. So if you remember in the downtown, there's a central core overlay, there's the colonial district overlay, and then there's a transitional overlay, the outer edge of that sub area. And within each of those, the main rules apply, but there's also some special things that apply in just those parts of that area. So what we're talking about here is creating the transit overlay on the residential areas close to the transit stations or major transit stops. And within that, that's where it's 4 units per lot versus 2, and the parking rules are a little bit different. Okay. And then there's just a number of definitions that will be updated in order to be reflective of changes to policy as well as code. In 18A30, which refers to
Ms. Spear,
discretionary.
I've got
Yes,
one more question.
sure.
I just want to ask a quick question about the air corridor zones, and that is the 2014 study that was done on the contour and off installation land use. Does that study ever get updated, or is it just a one and done study?
Is that the AICUZ, AICUZ? Yeah, I think they do that about every 15 to 20 years. And that's something that the military does. It's not something that city or local government would do. As far as I am aware, there's no plans in the near future to update that one,
Okay.
but
and
it
then-
will eventually.
And then just to follow up, out of that study, is there any formal agreement between the city and Department of Defense or any other entity as a result of that study, or like a letter certifying the plan? Or is it just a federal plan document?
The AICUZ is something that is conducted by the Department of Defense and also other federal agencies, and it ends up being presented to Congress. I don't know if they take a formal action to adopt it, but it is considered a federal plan. What the city of Lakewood has done is, because we are immediately adjacent and have this area within the city boundaries affected per their guidance, is decide, yes, we're going to support that concept of safety for our residents. We're going to change what's allowed uses within this part of the city as a result. And so that's why you have non-conforming residential uses in the air corridor zones. Other jurisdictions for a long time around this area, in some respects, might not have even been aware of that plan being in place or that report. However, due to the Southside Military and Communities Partnership over the last 15 years or so, those jurisdictions have been made aware. So for instance, Tacoma, just within the last 4 or 5 years, updated their zoning to reflect that they are also in an air corridor or an accident potential zone. And Pierce County has as well.
Okay, so it sounds like it's a federal plan with guidance, but insofar as a binding plan, it's not that. But the city agrees to, in partnership,
Yes.
and follow the guidance.
And you could consider it a background document, if you will, to the RCW that says the city has to be civilian and military compatibility has to be reflected in its regulations and its zoning. So the statute is very short, and that's all it says, is be compatible. But there's been some work by the Department of Commerce here in the Washington State, and the Washington Military Alliance was there for a while at the governor's level doing this as well, basically suggesting and taking that statutory one sentence and turning it into this. These are recommendations and best practices.
Okay, and then, sorry, last question. Are there other areas like throughout the state, like in Spokane would be other areas that also have this type of plan?
Yes, Air Force over in, I always lose the name, but by Spokane, by Tri-Cities, sorry.
Fairchild.
Yes, Airway Heights. They have something. And actually, some of the same rules apply to commercial airports, and which is why SeaTac would have some of the similar restrictions in land use as well. Renton might too, I'm not sure. And we actually, with Mr. Remack here, I don't know if he wants to talk to anything that's gone on in Kitsap County related to the naval base or any sort of safety limitations.
So they have some setbacks associated with railway that exist, but not with any airfield. But it does same type of scenario, some restrictions on what we can do in certain areas based on the in and out for the railway system.
Thank you. Okay. So coming to discretionary permits, that chapter of our code, and that is referring to a wide range of permits, but essentially it is those that aren't just permitted outright. So it might be a conditional use process, whether or not there's a hearing examiner involved. It might be, in some cases, things that you actually have to come to the council and get approval for. But within that is also the comprehensive plan amendments. And so just talking about when those are required to happen and when a quote emergency exists, you might be able to go out of the normal annual cycle. So that's being added to code. This is the area in our code where we have a cottage housing chapter. And what's being done here as a result and kind of trickling down from the changes with middle housing and accessory dwelling units, changing what are your increased densities that you can reach in the various zones, because to do the increased densities in R3 and R4, you would be going even more dense than what you can already all do now with ADUs and middle housing, which includes cottage housing. So it was kind of double dipping, if you will, or almost in some cases just conflicting, because the cottage housing predates all of that discussion by the state legislature. And then there's also the update to how long the hosting of a homeless encampment or settlement by a religious organization can be allowed, 6 months out of the year max. If you have one that's been in a particular location for 4 months, there has to be a 3-month break before it would come back to that location. So just some updates, and this is a state law requirement that the city is needing to comply with. 18A40 is where most of the changes are, because this is where land uses and how they are to be interpreted in our code is included and laid out by type of use. So there'll
Ms.
be.
Spear, I've
Sure.
got one more for you.
Sure.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just want to ask about the religious organization hosting. Are we to understand when those state laws come down that that's a floor, but then a city could theoretically add in a ceiling if it wanted to. It could add in a stricter policy as long as it complied with this.
If you mean by stricter that it's less than 6 months out of a year,
Mhm.
I don't know, Andrew, is that possible? Or is 6 months what you have to do? You're welcome to come right there.
Yeah, so it's actually a minimum requirement. So and this is, one thing to note is that this is specifically a requirement for religious organizations that are hosting. So it's not any other organizations that would be looking to locate. And it's, you could have longer stays, but it can't be shorter. It has to have a minimum requirement.
Perfect, thank you.
Thanks. So 18A40 again is the land uses, and you'll find a table in there, for instance, for agricultural uses, public parks and recreation, open space, residential, commercial, industrial, and each one of those lays out in each zone what is allowed and whether it's permitted outright, conditionally, or not at all. And then there's operation and development conditions that go with each one of those tables. What we're talking about within this is changing how long transitory accommodations are or must be allowed. The minimum that the code had was 90 days. That's being extended to 120. Allowing now in our commercial and industrial zones, quote, organic material management facilities. I don't know if you've heard this or seen it in the news, but now, excuse me again, organic food waste can go into your yard waste bins. And so this is just making sure that that is something that the city is allowing to happen should there be facilities in any of those zones. Essential public facilities, these are things that traditionally, historically have been very hard to place, whether it's in the county or a city. So sewer treatment plants, sometimes it's a hospital, sometimes it's a school, sometimes it's something else that basically we need, a gravel mine, we need, but people don't necessarily want it near them or adjacent to their property. And so there has been state law that says this is a quote, essential public facility. And as a result, it's got different levels of discretion at the local level for whether or not you can allow it or where you can put it. What this change is doing is saying, okay, that's all well and good. We have the essential public facilities, but what also needs to happen is a recognition that in the past, they have gone to areas that might be the quote, poorer parts of town, the other side of the tracks, whatever cliche you want to use. And we need to start maybe adding a little more equity into the analysis and making sure that it's not just those same places every time that take on these facilities. And then the biggie, of course, is allowing middle housing and ADUs within the single family areas per those state law changes. Design requirements, our code currently right now has some things that says the ADU has to look a certain way, or it has to be designed to match the single family house on the lot, or it's got one or two extra reviews that happens at the city for whatever reason. That is all being removed because that's something that we have to remove. The state law now says anything for these middle housing types and the ADUs, nothing different than what somebody who is putting a single family detached project down on a parcel would have to do. So we're removing some things that were required for ADUs. Then within a quarter mile of a major transit stop, so a little smaller area than the half-mile distance we've been talking about, there's actually a limitation on the types of parking requirements that the city can impose. And we've talked about this before, where in fact you have some places where you can't require on-site parking for an ADU. And so that's generated all of the conversation in Lakewood that's happened to date about, well, if you're not going to have people parking on site, if the property owner for whatever reason does not do that, where does that car go, assuming somebody actually has one? Is it going to be on the streets, which might be too narrow to allow on-street parking, right? So in any event, the state law says this is where we're at with parking requirements, so we're following that. The other one that's come up with ADUs is that they are now allowed explicitly to be owned by a different owner than the primary residence. So what's happened up to this point, kind of very generalization, but you've got somebody with a house, they've got a bigger yard, or they've got a space above or below the main living space where they want to put an ADU in. and they still own all of the property, they pay the taxes, they get the mail, blah, blah, blah. This is now saying as an accessory dwelling unit can be owned by someone else. And that can be done either through lot splitting subdivision, or it can be done through condos, the condozation process. So we have to do this. The questions that we're asking internally now is how to anticipate things like, is the US Post Office ready to deal with addressing questions, which can get very complicated, leaving all of this alone in Lakewood's experience. And also, what do you do with the land underneath the ADU? We are just talking condoization, or are we talking suddenly we're going to have a run on lot splitting or subdividing properties? The lot has to be at least the minimum size for a zone. So if someone were wanting to split their lot, that might limit if their lot isn't big enough to split legally to be 2 legal lots. But we're just anticipating some questions there, and so we're trying to prepare some internal discussion and best practices we can share with the public.
Mr. Larson.
Does this allow, I shouldn't say does it allow, it seems to me that an idea for placement of an ADU on a lot would not necessarily, and individual ownership would not necessarily require ownership of the land underneath the ADU. And so you could have a land lease, for instance, that by certain terms, instead of the subdivision. And I wonder whether that would preclude the necessity to have a legal buildable lot for the ADU because of the ownership factor.
Yes, that's part of the scheme. Yes.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Lindholm.
And I'm guessing that's a scenario in which condoing the ADU would make sense.
Right, correct. Yes.
Now, what does that say? I guess this is a larger conversation, but what does that say for property taxes? What does that say for, the relationship between the owner and the condo unit? Yeah.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of unanticipated questions and results, I think, over the next few years as this starts to come to fruition, that the legislature, as quickly as they've moved on this stuff, maybe didn't fully anticipate. And so we're going to all be learning together.
Is it fair to say as density goes up, property taxes would want to follow?
What I have heard through talking to third parties, including those that are involved with commercial appraisals or the assessor treasurer for Pierce County, is that tax property valuation is going to be affected if something is actually built around you. So it's always the comparative property within a near location, correct? In your neighborhood, whatever. So come tomorrow, these rules go into effect, you don't suddenly automatically have a property tax increase. However, if people around you start to add ADUs and add building valuation value to their property, that's going to knock up everybody in the neighborhood.
Yeah, and what I've seen kind of out there in the world is that the moment somebody built an ADU, they're not saying that because of that increased density, we're raising property taxes, but they're saying the property is now more valuable.
Right.
And therefore, it'll have more higher property taxes.
Mr. Larson.
It occurs to me that this could be a valuable family financial planning strategy. So the children would own the ADU as part of a division of an estate in the future, something like that. So I think that's a good latitude to have in the new law.
Any other questions? Okay. Two things that are within the station district zoning, or excuse me, regulations. There was, whether it was an error or not, I honestly can't remember. But anyway, we have type 4 and type 5 group homes listed in one part as being allowed in these sub areas and not being allowed in another part. And the intent was to not have them because of the type of development that are desired within the downtown and the station district. So this is just cleaning that up, getting rid of that discrepancy in code. And then there's also some language about what can be required of emergency shelters or emergency housing facilities under state law. That has changed again. If you'll remember, in 23, the city adopted the allowance for emergency shelters and housing all along the commercial corridor where motels are allowed. That was the state law that the city followed. But this is now looking at what can you then say, okay, you're going to come into this part of our city because that's where it's zoned. what can we require of you as a jurisdiction? Those rules have changed now per the state legislature as well. So I talked about this a little bit already, but the overlay district, the idea of all of the residential zones are either R1, 2, 3, or 4. And then we also have our mixed residential and our multifamily zones that have been here before as well. But there's this overlay within the half mile of transit, major transit stops, where different rules are going to apply, meaning you can have 4 units per lot versus, 4 units per lot versus 2. And then those different parking standards may apply as well. So I will provide you graphics that will make much more sense perhaps for some who learn by seeing rather than hearing, but that's the concept. Questions there? All right, jumping to the next chapter, site planning and general development standards. So this is, again, you get told this is your zone that you're in. This is what's allowed, either yes, no, or maybe. And then we get into what do you do in certain situations. So you have those updated densities now on these residential zones, but that may be affected, it will be affected by whether or not there are critical areas on the site, how far away you are from the major transit stops, and whether if multiple units are being constructed on a lot, one or more of them are considered below market rate or quote affordable. Because all of those are caveats to the recent changes to state law about housing density. And so we're reflecting that in our development regulations. The mixed residential and multifamily use zones are getting updated densities as well to kind of fall in line with what's happening in the single family zones. There is the removal in MR1 and 2, mixed residential 1 and 2, of the minimum lot size. And then there's an increase of the allowed densities in what's called transit-oriented commercial and central business district zones. Those 2 zones are each exclusive to a subarea. So TOC is only in the Station District and CBD is only in the downtown. Any questions out of that? Okay. Then we jump to parking. There are some various and sundry clarifications to the commercial parking standards. I wouldn't say any of them are very significant, but they are in the draft code that you received before. And then we've talked several times now already tonight about the idea that you've got these additional units now on what's been traditionally a single family lot. Where does the car go? Or how often are those cars going to be allowed on-site, off-site, in a shared parking situation, et cetera. And so the parking standards are showing changes to reflect where there's going to be a requirement to have at least 1 spot per unit on-site, where that can be required, but where it can't, closer to transit, Lakewood's code is going to reflect those requirements from the state. And then we also have in Lakewood the transportation demand management strategy requirement. So you may have already heard of this in your, whatever your various day job may be, but in the state of Washington, if you are an employer with 100 or more employees, the idea here is to come up with transportation demand strategies that reduce the number of single occupancy vehicles coming to your location. So the city of Lakewood is actually one because we do have more than 100 employees. The hospital, the colleges, some of the other larger businesses in the city would also have this apply. Going to our chapter 18A90, this has been in the chapter for the title 18A, excuse me, for a long time, but the housing incentives program is having a lot of changes this cycle because of all of the other required changes. So where are our incentives now going to be? Looking at inclusionary density bonuses, as the code reads right now, depending on the type or depending on which zone you're in or the type of development you're proposing, it says you can get this much of an increase in density. This is unifying that to an increase of up to 25% of density if you have low or extremely low income housing in the project. And you can also get density bonuses, and these are not adding on top of each other, but the first and the third bullet are separate. The other one is talking about if you just have units affordable at 60 or 80% AMI, so that's the moderate and maybe the low as well. Those are a separate list of density allowances. And then there are also density bonuses allowed if you are an affordable housing developer working in partnership with a religious organization. So all of this is intended to help spur development of affordable housing units. If you go back and think about our 2044 housing targets, it's broken out by you got to be affordable to these different economic levels. These are our attempts to try to incentivize, I should say, affordable developers to come into the city. We already talked about this a little bit, but as we get to the code 18B for downtown, it's to remove those 2 group homes. And then there's also the need to require, or excuse me, the need to add parking space regulations as required by state law. In the Station District, that subarea code 18C, a same removal of type 4 and 5 group homes. And then it's also, because that does have a major transit stop within it, changing the parking regulation for accessory dwelling units within half a mile of a major transit stop.
I have a question, Ms. Spear.
Yes.
What's wrong with a type 4 or 5 group home that makes it not wanted to be in these particular areas?
You have an answer for that? Andrew's going to help out just because I don't have that at the top of my head.
I'm going from the top of my head too, but type 4, I believe, is juvenile offenders. So that would be somewhat of a more secure facility. And then type 5 is, I think it's sexual offenders. With that, I can take a quick look and confirm that, but they tend to be the higher security facilities that are not, that would have a lot of neighbors concerned, which is why they would be included in the essential public facilities. So.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, sorry, another question.
Sorry, very quickly. I think we saw earlier that the ADU parking regulations were within a quarter of transit, and I see here it's within half. Are those different?
There are different requirements at different distances. So at the quarter mile mark is where you start to see things in code that says you cannot require on-site parking for an ADU within a quarter mile of transit. Within half a mile of transit, there's also things that apply based on the type of frontage improvements you might be able to require, the number of car spaces you might be required to allow as a minimum. Anything else, sir?
So some of these seem like they're a little half-baked by the state. I'll be just upfront. There are actually 5 different requirements that are in play, some of which aren't applicable in Lakewood. The ones that are relevant here have to do with a half mile around stations, and then the density, I believe, is a quarter mile. Yeah. It's a problem because there are different definitions of what transit can be depending on the different provisions in the state code. If we're looking at senior housing, for example, that's different than what we're talking about with ADUs. So it's a half mile. The other provision that's included in the revisions is that in cases where there isn't on-street parking that's available, this may not be, there may be a need to demonstrate that there is some other form of parking that the homeowner can access. So that, okay.
Yeah, this was complicated a little bit as well, Commissioner Lindholm, by the fact that some parking requirements were addressed in one bill one year, and another set was in another year in another bill, and they didn't mesh. So we're trying to reconcile things after the fact.
And it seems especially complicated in jurisdictions that don't allow for on-street parking. That complicates it further. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So that is the summary of everything that's in the development regulation title. It's 18A, B, and C. I'm going to now jump a little bit over to the discussion about short-term rental regulation. So again, this is something that was talked about last year by the then Planning Commission body. But essentially right now, the city says if you have an accessory dwelling unit, yes, it can be used as a short-term vacation rental. There are the requirements to have a business license and a safety inspection before it opens for use as a vacation rental. What is being proposed, or what was proposed in 23, was to add some additional development regulations that are common across the state now, that just tighten that up a little bit more and maybe add to the city's rental housing safety program inspections, all of the short-term rentals. So you would have inspections not only to apartment buildings, for instance, you would be having people coming in and inspect accessory dwelling units used as short-term rentals in that 5-year cycle that our program has. The other piece to it that was discussed last year, both at the Planning Commission and then at the council, was whether, because of all this stuff where we're adding all of these additional potential for accessory dwelling units, whether to prohibit that as a short-term rental in the city of Lakewood. And I won't go all the way through it. I'll provide to those of you, well, to everybody, but those who are new, a summary of the recommendations, why the Planning Commission voted like it did last year. People expressed individually when the vote was taken why they felt the way they did. But from the staff's perspective, the reason the prohibition was recommended was because the allowance for this ADUs that have been expanded so much by the legislature in recent years is because they are attempting to spur permanent housing, whether it be rental or home ownership, without having to expand land use. Essentially, it's you're putting multiple units on a particular lot. If what is happening instead is Airbnb options for, just to be picking on one particular provider, if that's the way a jurisdiction goes, that's not creating new housing, affordable in theory because of how it is constructed and its size. That's not following the intent behind the bill that allowed those ADUs in the first place. What we had from the Planning Commission was a different perspective. The majority opinion was, actually, if you allow the option for this to be an economic revenue source for those who build it, at least in the first however many years they'd give it a try, that will incentivize them, that will spur them to build these units. And then if they find they're not able to get enough short-term rental activity to support the construction and maintenance of that unit over time, it will then convert to some other permanent type of housing. So it was seen as a economic benefit to allow short-term rentals as a way to get people to build these in the first place. So all of that went to the commission, the council. The council said, we're not going to take action on any of the regulations, any of the definitions, or the question about the short-term rental prohibition. We're going to put that off until the 24 package. Fast forward to today. What you're going to see in your packet is the original stuff that came from city staff. So those of you who were here on the commission last year, yes, you will be talking about, again, the prohibition or not of short-term rentals in ADUs. You've got 4 new commissioners, so the conversation will certainly be different than it was a year ago. The outcome might be the same, but you've got 4 new people's opinions to consider. So all of that will be in front of you as part of this package and part of the hearing on June 5th. Any questions on that?
How is the city currently tracking the number of short-term rentals?
They are not right now. What we are doing is we are in the contract phase of working with a company called Granicus, who will be able to report to us on a very regular basis the number of units and whether they have an active business license, whether they are reporting to the state as well as to the city that they're even there. So we will have that before the end of the year.
Sorry, if I may. So that's for reporting for short-term rentals. If a homeowner is renting an ADU on a long-term basis, that would not be included.
That would not be included if it is not a short-term rental under that type of business license. If what they're doing is acting as a landlord, they would have to apply all of the Landlord Tenant Act rules in the state. And I honestly don't know if a business license per se is required for doing that. I don't know.
I know we require that for multifamily. I don't know if we require that on the single family basis.
We'll clarify for that.
On the same property that the homeowner lives, right? Like if
Yeah.
somebody owns a duplex in the city of Lakewood, they were required to have a business license, is my understanding. But if they live on the property and have an ADU, maybe that's a different story.
I think that's correct, but we'll verify that for you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll look into it and then.
Sorry, one last question. What is the definition of a short-term rental? 3 months, 6 months, 30
It's
days?
if you have any rental that is less than 30 days. So it could
Which I
be,
understand to be the tax cutoff as well. The tax code changes it. Yeah.
yeah. Any questions on the short-term rental stuff? Okay. The public noticing I mentioned at the start, this is really following strictly what's under the Open Public Meetings Act changes to state law this year, where not only do you have to say, yes, we're collecting feedback or seeking public comment, we have to tell you the start and the end date of that time frame and how what written comments can be submitted. That's basically stuff that the city of Lakewood already does, but we need to incorporate it into code. All right, so any questions on that? I'm going to shift topics once again if you guys are okay. All right, you've seen this table before, but to walk through it again quickly before I start in on the downtown and the station district reviews. On the left-hand side, you see the total housing and job net new units that are the targets for 2044. And then the following columns after that break out the share of that total that are focused in the downtown sub-area, the station district sub-area, or the rest of the city. And then you'll also see for the housing, the 574 emergency housing unit target that the city has for 2044. When we look at the downtown, what has happened since 2018, we are currently at about 28% of the housing unit targets through 2035. And why does I say 2035? Because the 2035 date was used in both of the sub-area plans rather than 2044. This was done 8 or 3 years ago, so the 2044 targets weren't even a gleam in anyone's eye yet. And so what we did with these two was go to 2035 instead. And so what you have here is an analysis of a 2035 end date. But in any event, where we sit in Lakewood's downtown as that we're at about 28% of the reaching the target because of the Alliance Residential Project that is being talked about right now. That would be the one that's locating next to and on top of where Barnes & Noble is currently located. It's anticipated at this point to be 426 affordable housing units. The idea here also is that the downtown is actually a regional urban growth center under the Puget Sound Regional Council scheme. And by being one, the downtown is subject to getting additional transportation funding from PSRC because of the center. So what we're trying to do is track not only success under our sub-area plan, but we're trying to track success as a regional center in order to continue to be able to qualify for funding from the PSRC, transportation funding. Jobs, it's a little bit different percentage here. What has happened is only about 187 jobs have been added, net new. And when this was adopted, 3/4 of the city's 2035 job target citywide was put in the downtown. That was the focus. There's been discussion really preliminarily, but there's been discussion about potentially looking at dispersing some of this percentage of jobs to other parts of the city, to the station district as in particular, just because in really recent time, the station district is moving a little bit faster on some economic development fronts. So does it make sense to maybe plan for jobs happening, yes, in the downtown for sure, but maybe not 3/4 of the city's full share. But what you see here at the bottom again in graphic form is we're at about 2.6% of the target. We're 6 years into that 27-year timeframe. Only about 1/10 of 1% of the target for square footage. And that is because the vast majority of new jobs that have come into existing spaces. So we haven't had new construction of commercial space. Any questions on either one of those, the housing or the job target achieving?
One question.
Yeah.
Mr. Spear, do we have any data on the efficiency of our permitting application process and so projects moving through from beginning to approval and how we're doing on managing those flows?
Yes, that is something that is available in some respects just through our public permitting system. There's a portal that anyone can go to and track either a specific project, how it's doing with permit timelines, or in general, if you go, I think it's on the website. If it's not, it's something that's available through the department directly to say, how are you guys doing on your permit timelines? It's something that I know They track on a weekly basis on the current planning side. And obviously, when you've got, for instance, right now, there's a run on the counter, if you will, because we're about to engage in an update to the building codes. New code is about to go into effect, and so you have a number of applicants trying to beat that deadline and vest under the older code. In other situations, it's seasonal. Spring and summer is where you're going to have more building than in the middle of winter. But overall, we do try to track that. And then in addition, the state law has now changed to where we have to create a public report that has to go to Commerce every year, and that will start next year.
Thank you.
Sure.
Ms. Spear, we don't need it tonight, but I'm curious if you could look into the previous slide, our housing.
Mhm.
We've got under 80% and below. The affordable or affordable would actually be 80 to when it depends on who defines it, but
Mhm.
80 to 100. And so everything that would be considered needs assistance would be 80 and below. This is the way I've read it
Generally
by
speaking,
Puget Sound Regional
subsidized,
Council.
yeah.
So if that's how it's defined, and we're looking at these basically two large pools of units we're trying to satisfy a goal on, maybe we could measure both of those. How, because I think 426 will all go towards that goal.
Mhm.
And I'm curious where, as we're tracking this, it would be nice to be able to see, and not just us, but the council as well, see the progress we're making or not.
Sure. Thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mr. Larson.
Where does the home operated businesses employment fit into this? This is just downtown, I realize, but I wonder if citywide we have a different look.
The best way we would be able to tell you about the number of number of home occupations would be tracking business licenses. And we can do that. It's where now, it used to be the city of Lakewood did all of the approvals for business licenses, but within the last few years, it goes through the state. So the city is involved, but the state is the one that takes money and then lets us know that a business license has been approved. We're able to track and tell you how many business licenses for different types of businesses and where they're located are. So yes, we could pull that report if it was requested.
It just seems to me that that's part of the picture that
Sure.
that we should be including in an overall, how many jobs are in Lakewood and how many are forming, how many are moving. That includes home operated businesses to a large degree, I think. I don't really know, but it feels like it.
Mhm.
I don't know that it's trackable to get all of it, because I know for employers or employees who are working for people remotely now, because they could do that and wasn't able to do that before, they're not registered because they're not the business owner.
Correct.
And so it's hard to track. I know that other cities have struggled with this nebulous amount of people who've come out of the downtown and spread out into the suburbs. But yeah, I don't know if you have any data on that. I don't even know how you'd be able to get that, but
The closest thing we have that reflects that is the transportation report that I provided a few meetings ago that reflected actually a drop in and trips to and from the downtown since 2016. In part, everyone thinks because of COVID and its effects on remote work, teleworking. So there's fewer people driving to get to their job. They are still employed presumably, but they're doing it from their house. And so that's affected actually our transportation planning a little bit. But yeah, I wouldn't be able to pull a report, I don't think, that specifically says the number of people that are working from home for a Lakewood-based business, or if the number of employees changes over time or anything like that.
Really quick. So is there, if a major employer wants to move into, like, say, Pack Highway area, South Tacoma Way area, outside of the downtown area, but I mean, is there policy or some sort of something set up so that like the downtown can get credit for those jobs, or is that just, those are just new jobs? Because I'm trying to kind of fathom how the downtown with the land use that it is, which is low level, a lot of box chain retail, not, not very residential, just old suburban commercial, like what is the economic vision to add 7,000 jobs? That's either like a ton of Starbuckses everywhere, or that's like some major, it's like some major office, and the land use, I mean, really, I guess the town center is kind of maybe, or maybe like these kind of larger shopping area lots are the areas to absorb that type of land use. But still, I guess I'm trying to fathom how a major office or light manufacturing or something that has that density for jobs, how that land use type fits in the downtown.
The vision of the sub-area plan is mixed use and higher density housing with a strong concentration of office and retail jobs. And the thought process at the time is it's kind of a domino effect, and maybe we'll see it come true once Alliance Residential is here, the additional businesses that will want to locate around that new population. But it kind of feeds on itself. Then you have more people, you have more businesses thinking I've got enough of a base to support my business. The businesses here, new housing development interest comes in. And because there are incentives within the downtown that are not available in other parts of the city, that is where the development would happen. Whether the 700 or 7,369 new job goal for the downtown is realistic, I think the staff is talking about that, and the council will likely as well, to see if there is a desire to maybe let that go to other parts of the city. Part of the complicating factor, though, is going back to that PSRC regional center designation, because there's a requirement to keep that standing of having so many jobs and or people in that sub-area. And so if we take away too many jobs, we're going to automatically lose that standing. We lose the transportation funding, and it's all a paper exercise, but it ends up talking money as well.
I really just want to clarify what you just said.
Sure.
Because I think what I heard was, if the number's not big enough on the paper, even though it doesn't make sense for us to do that, and we have no way to get to that we would lose funding, and we're not going to change what we think we might be able to do, even though we know we can't actually do it with what we have. We're just going to do this because the block on the paper says we have to.
Welcome to the world of the Growth Management Act.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And to add to that, from what I've seen, PSRC, do they report on the progress of their centers? Like the number, the progress, like how well are the centers?
Yeah, regional centers.
Yeah,
Yeah, they
meeting
do.
their targets.
They do, and starting next year, actually, they're going to do a whole new designation process. They're going to go back to all of the pre-existing urban growth centers, including Lakewoods, and reevaluate them to see if they're performing as promised on paper. And so part of the recommendations actually that are coming from our consultant regarding the downtown sub-area plan is we need to be looking to prep for that review, and maybe even do something like a mini market study to show how we're going to achieve what's planned in order to continue to be able to be called a regional center. Again, the end goal is the funding that can come to a regional center through PSRC for transportation.
So along that, I don't want to veer off too far, but I have noticed that the boundary lines of the downtown sub-area tend to veer around parcelage
Yes.
instead of up to intersections. And if the goal and the intent of the centers of the center designation is to achieve transportation improvements, then wouldn't it seem to make sense to design the boundaries to incorporate or to edge up to intersections or major roads, so that transportation funding has that impact? So like, for example, the very north kind of wonky edge of the downtown, it doesn't go up or I guess it ends at like Kiwanis Park, but it doesn't go up to Gravely Lake and Stilligum. But Gravely Lake and Stilligum is a major intersection that's in one of our capital plans or capital projects in the tip. And so, which will be an expensive project to, so we're gonna need the transportation funding anyway, with or without the sub-area designation. So I mean, I guess I'm saying, at some point, when we look at the boundaries of this, of the center, going into that process, it would make sense to, instead of try to veer around parcelage, take the boundaries up to an intersection where you're gonna need the transportation funding to fix the road that's gonna absorb all the impact from the land use that you're densifying.
And there's a little bit of give and take that's happened historically, actually, with the sub-area, the regional urban center boundary. When the city first designated it and Puget Sound Regional Council accepted it, it was significantly larger. And it actually went almost into and overlapping the boundaries for what's now the Station District. It was a larger area and it was a little bit more tied to maybe transportation corridors. When this sub-area plan, though, was adopted, the decision was made to make the two have the same boundaries. Not to say that has to stay that way forever. So if there is a desire that you want to recommend to council, great. Or if council wants to take that up to say, hey, it makes sense to separate those two again and make them two different shapes and have the reasons why. That's possible. But as it stands now, the thought was the downtown is where we want to grow. It's where we want to have money for the transportation in order to grow. And it was, again, that domino effect. Okay. We've talked about the group home conversation. So in the downtown sub-area package pieces that will be coming to the hearing on the 5th of June, there are a couple of recommendations, one of which we just barely talked about, this idea of a market study report. The second relates to the transportation mitigation fee program. And so I'm going to walk through that a little bit. We talked about this in more detail Monday night with the city council. So if this tickles your fancy, you're welcome to watch Monday night's discussion with council to have a more detailed discussion about it. But I'm going to walk through the basic facts and figures that they had on Monday as well. So when the downtown sub-area plan was adopted, part of it was also a SEPA planned action. And what that was to say is if you, as a developer, come into this downtown boundary and your development fits within what we are assuming build out to be. So you're coming in with a new multifamily project and it's so many units, that feeds into what we've already planned for and your impacts have already been analyzed. You don't have to go through SEPA, that analysis for your particular project. Same for any other type of use. But part of that process was to say, at build out, we need an assumed, you'll see it along the bottom line here of this slide, 6,658 transportation trips for all of that anticipated build out. That's what the estimate was in 2018 for increased traffic in the downtown because of the new jobs and the new homes. The mitigation to the transportation system in order to stay at the levels of service established by the city, totaled at that time $28,945,000 worth of transportation improvements. And again, that's 2018 dollars. Obviously, if you were to redo those numbers today, they'd be higher. How much higher, we don't know yet. But by saying in the system that the city council adopted, half of the cost of the transportation is going to be paid by private development. The other half is going to be paid for through public funds, be it the general fund, be it a grant the city qualifies for, be it the funding that comes through PSRC, what have you. So half of that total 28 million and change is going to be covered by the private development to the tune of $2,174 per trip, because if you divide your total amount of the transportation cost by the number of trips that's anticipated, that's the total you get. So that was the initial adoption of a transportation mitigation fee that only applied in the downtown. It wasn't any other part of the city. After that was adopted, there was an administrative policy adopted in the city, which further clarified or changed the way that calculation actually was finalized. So They go through the system as an applicant to fill out the paperwork. The city staff takes a look at their uses, compares it to the, what's called the ITE manual, the International Traffic Engineer Manual, that says this type of a use has an average of this many trips per day. A single family house, 10 trips per day. A coffee drive-through, significantly more than that, right? There's a whole list of uses that are used as part of the calculation. Then the city said in its policy, however, you can come to that initial number, but if you are coming into an existing space where there used to be something else, the only thing you're going to pay for is any increase over that last use's number of trips. So coffee stand A goes away, coffee stand B plops itself down in the same building. Under the ITE manual, it's the same number of trips. There is no TMF collected, even though it's a new business, because that last business had that same effect and impact on the transportation system. Counter that with, I did this Monday night. Let's see if I can do it again. Bakery is in a location, so much traffic per day is from a bakery. They go away. Starbucks comes in on that same property. They don't rebuild. They just move into the same space. A lot more traffic to that business than the bakery had. More trips per day. They're paying that delta of additional traffic trips. Not all of their trips, but what was above the bakery's list. So in addition to that, so that was one way to limit how many TMFs were being collected from private development. The other thing was there was no cutoff for how long ago that last business could be in a space. So instead of saying you have 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, some number of time before we just say, you know what, you're a new business. It's been vacant for so long. All of your trips are going to need to be funded. It was, if there was ever something in that building or TI or whatever it is that you're doing, that is going to be credited against what you have to pay. Most places will say it has to be within a certain number of months or a certain number of years. So again, the city was limiting how much it was collecting because it was saying there is no end date for when you can get a credit for a past use. So does that make sense? I'm throwing a lot at you at once, I know. Okay. And that's kind of what this says here. The other piece to this is that we only have 10 years to spend these fees before they have to get returned. So if we're collecting money over time as a jurisdiction, within 10 years, if those haven't been put to a transportation project for this sub area, it goes back to the current property owner. That's just a side note. So long story short, here we go. Under the administrative policy, since 2018, $121,731 have been collected from projects. If you had not had the administrative policy in place, it would have been $1,094,382. So roughly 10% is what's been collected to date because of the administrative policy clauses. And no funding has been set aside on the public side to this point for the 50% that's supposed to come from the public share. So the very bottom line on this page is showing you that half of 1% of that total cost in transportation projects has been collected to date under the TFM program. And I don't care why or what or when. If you look at that, that is not a successful transportation planning mechanism over the last 6 years. So the question that comes to you, and then the council is hoping that you would provide them with some feedback. They talked about this a little bit Monday night, is what are the alternatives to what we are currently doing? And there's options that the council was introduced with, but you're going to be having an opportunity to chew on this a little more as well. Obviously, the first choice the council could do is just say that administrative policy either needs to change or go away altogether. There could be a time limit on how far back you can go to get that credit for past trips. Or you could even look at reducing or exempting certain uses from having to pay the TMF. You could also take a look at the 50-50 split that's currently in place for how much is coming from the public versus the private side to pay for transportation. Maybe that changes. You could also just say the TMF program is not something that's working and we'd rather do away with it and collect funding some other way for transportation. It could be an impact fee citywide. It could be those transportation grants. It could be general funds or something in combination of these three things. You could also go the concurrency route, which is if private development and public funds, whatever they may be, aren't keeping up with the levels of service established for the roads, and you get to a point where the congestion goes above the level of service adopted by the city, transportation, development stops until the transportation system is improved. The other way, the kind of nuclear option, if you will, is to say, we don't want to do the collection of the fees, be it an impact fee, be it the mitigation fee or something else. And we also recognize that we're going to have growth because we need it, we want it. We're not going to have the funding for transportation improvements necessarily. So we're actually going to change our levels of service on the roads and say, where once upon a time we established, if you think of your elementary school report card, A through F, right? Same concept. A is free flowing transportation, F is congestion all the time. If you've got some roads that are classified as C, and because of new growth without any transportation mitigation, it goes to D or even E, the city could say, we're going to change our level of service, and we're going to say, yes, that's the truth. We've got new development. The transportation system is affected, and we recognize that. So again, it's a whole range of choices, and these are not the only choices. So these are some of the things that we're going to ask as part of your recommendation to City Council. You include some findings or something for them to be able to consider as well. Any questions?
Yes.
Sure.
Mr. Spear, is there any data on impact? Obviously, big number not achieved, less than 0.5%. Do we have any data in front of us that we can look at and observe that was the impact of the success of this program?
Can you ask that in a different way?
Okay, so we wanted to collect $28 million, right? And have it sitting there for up to 10 years. We didn't do that. What is the real world impact of that today?
The real world impact.
Did we go grab grant money and fund some other project some other way? Did we just not do any projects? Has there been no need up to this point? And if that's the case, how far are we away from the need of those funds?
Yeah. No, those projects have not been done. They are still on the transportation list for the city for the downtown area. There were some projects in this area that have been completed, but they predate the sub-area plan, and their funding was through a different grant process. Whether we have needed it, quote, or not yet, I would say you've seen the way traffic around here hasn't changed that much. Again, we talked about just a few minutes ago, job commuting patterns have changed due to COVID and remote work. So the anticipated impacts haven't been as much as thought so far. But we're about to, for instance, have this new development of 426 units come into the downtown, and that will definitely affect the transportation grid in the town center in particular. And so there's going to start to be much more attention and frustration from drivers and those residents, presumably, about the traffic system if it's not changed.
And that, talking about that particular project, I think we had a pretty in-depth discussion in here about that previously. Isn't part of those, that permitting process and that project alone, doesn't that include set aside funds for some of that impact outside of the TMF?
The TMF is what they would use as the system
That is
within the
what's
down. Yes,
built
yes.
into that.
And so I don't know what the final calculation will be for them yet. They're not quite there. However, even if they were to pay 100% of what they are, quote, supposed to, and we don't apply the administrative policy, that's only half of the cost of the transportation mitigation for that project, because the other half is supposed to come from a public source. And so the need to figure out how we're going to pay for these things or recognize that they aren't going to be built for a certain amount of time is really the question of the moment.
Perfect. Thank you.
Just one final note on the transportation question. We have applied as a city for a federal grant that would allow us to look at the motorized and the non-motorized system citywide, but particularly focused in the downtown, to update all the cost estimations and redo the citywide transportation. I guess I'm not using the right term, but the level of service analysis again, to be able to see if what was used in 2018 is still accurate. for what's needed as of today. If we do get that grant, we would be able to start using it before the end of the year. We're expecting to hear the announcement in late June, whether or not we get that grant. So any other questions on the downtown sub-area?
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
About the concurrency angle and the concurrency approach. Other cities do have a concurrency ordinance. Renton has a concurrency ordinance, but it's not the easiest to manage at times because even if, a development comes in and its impact, like a major employer comes in and its impacts are so large that an intersection that is already performing poorly and there's not enough room to expand it, and then there's further impacts, it's just, in some cases, it's hard that, that intersection is still unfixable. And so I guess on one hand, you can collect fees in lieu and apply it to others, but then if you don't fix that intersection, you, in some cases, have to give the funds back to the developer. So, I mean, there are complications around it. I am curious though, like what is Lakewood's temperature to that approach?
I really don't know. This was just first talked about with the council 2 nights ago. And so for sure, this is going to be a focus of their discussion before they adopt the 24 update. They may decide, yes, things need to happen, but it won't happen in 24. It'll be start planning, start figuring out, start doing your studies. But this is one of the issues that now that we've done this review of the last 6 years plus of the downtown sub-area plan's performance, this is one glaring example of where something needs to change.
And I do want to react with a couple more thoughts or just comments, and that is, which I've said before at another meeting, but I just want to say it again, and that is if the city doesn't get the RAISE grant that will pay for the existing and forecasting and the update of the transportation model and the level of service analysis, I think that the city should still plan to invest some local funds to do that analysis nonetheless, because just completing that analysis, it's a few $100,000 at the most, but you get the results, then the data that you get from it are what I think the city needs to further support and develop a full-blown revised traffic impact fee ordinance, if that's where it's going to go. I also wanted to say too that, I do have concerns about the notion and the concept baked into this TMF ordinance, the way it works now, that the notion that okay, Bed and Bath Beyond left, they were permitted based on whatever number of trips back in, I don't even know when it was, 2003. I'm making it up, but a long time ago, 20 years ago. And so now if I don't know, retail space number 2 comes in, the notion that they're paying their traffic impact fees based on a small delta, because their trips I don't think their trips are going to be that different. And or maybe it's credited, but yet maybe it's such a different type of business that maybe has more truck activity, or maybe it's a gym that likes to do outdoor outdoor activities with pedestrians that are out in the street and in the parking lot interacting. I don't know, I'm making up scenarios, but the point that I think that it's not fair to the revenue sourcing to only collect so little, because new businesses that are coming in are only required to pay on a delta of, especially on a baseline that is so old.
Right.
So, so for that reason, I don't really want to see the city continue to support the existing ordinance. And also, I mean, 400 trips or 400 units coming in, and now, the city can only collect, a fraction of of TIF fees or whatever, mitigation fees for traffic impacts that extend probably all the way out to Bridgeport. You know, and then the city's still on the hook to find local funds to pay for that. So anyway, for those reasons, I'm on my soapbox, but
It's a conundrum.
yeah.
And to respond to that too, one of the things that was brought up as another option I didn't include in this tonight was actually just assuming you wanted to keep some kind of administrative policy or if it didn't go away altogether. And we went back to what the pure TMF was intended to be adopted as in 2018. Change the timing for how far back you can go. And you would start with the base trips as of the year 2018 when this was developed, when this was adopted, as opposed to whenever the building was built and however long ago somebody last occupied a space. That's another option, is to just create a timeline where this is the furthest back you can go no matter what. And then also look at what those administrative policy caveats are and do away with them or change them, et cetera. Yeah.
But I guess I would say too, that I think that it would be productive for council to take up this topic and address it sooner than later, because because this is what happens. Major developments come in because they know they have a window, and then or at least because they know that they can get vested, you know, in a window that is an advantage to them. And so, and then, you know, the city's left holding the bag, so to speak, on being able to collect more revenues, I guess.
Maybe I'll just piggyback on that, because I see there's so many different things there, and we're not going to be able to solve it tonight. This is just the idea stage. But I certainly agree. We need to try and solve that. And we've got, well, actually, I'll just save my comments for when we've got a little more meat, because I think we've got the concept out there, and these are just introduction of ideas. I'll save mine for another day. We've got only a few minutes left.
Okay. All right, so
I'm sorry. is there
just
anything-
to finish up the Station District one, it'll go quicker. Same idea, where you had a certain number of housing units planned for and a certain number of jobs planned for within the sub area by the year 2035. And where we sit with some additional new housing that's planned and underway right now in Station District, we're at about 19% of the 2035 target. And this is just since 2021. So this is performing better than the downtown one did. Granted, this is really coming out of COVID before it really got implemented, but at the same time, this is where we sit as of the first 2 years of this sub-area being in place. In terms of jobs, Lakewood Landing, we've talked about before, it was intended to be a 30-acre mixed-use, multi-phased site development in this sub-area. However, since the Station District plan was adopted, the central section of what would have been Lakewood Landing was purchased and is now becoming the Neighborhood Fulfillment Center. I think they've actually started to make improvements to the property over on Pacific Avenue. But the number of jobs for the Neighborhood Fulfillment Center is anticipated at 330. And so that's almost 35% of the full job target for this sub-area. So again, taking a look at the balance between the jobs allocated for downtown versus here versus the rest of the city is something the council is maybe open to hearing from you about. But as of now, we have this much movement in terms of jobs because of that new fulfillment center coming in the Station District. The two recommendations for this sub-area plan that you'll see in front of you as part of the big package is to remove reference to Lakewood Landing, because at least as initially anticipated, it's not going to happen. And also to change how often this plan is reviewed going forward. After 2024, downtown is going to become a 5-year review, and the recommendation is to do the same for the Station District sub-area plan. So rather than an every 2-year process of how are we doing, it becomes on a 5-year basis, which will tie in with the rest of the comp plan 5 or 10-year updates that are also happening. So those are the two for this part of the package. Just wrapping up, we have changed the schedule just slightly, not for when your public hearing will be at the Planning Commission, which is your next meeting, June 5th, but we have taken And I apologize if I haven't sent you this email yet, but we are asking that you plan for a meeting on July 10th. We were originally going to cancel all July and August meetings, but given what's going on with the pace at which we're able to give you information, we wanted to make sure that you had enough time to really digest it, talk about it, make the amendments you may want to make. So action on July 10th is what's scheduled for Planning Commission. And then that moves things forward by 2 weeks for the city council process. Their public hearing is now scheduled for August 19th rather than August 5th. We are recommending to the council is that rather than the usual, an ordinance is effective 30 days after they take action, it would be the 24 stuff doesn't go into effect until January 1st of 25. So any questions on schedule or where we're at with that? Okay, that is it, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Spear. We do have Mr. Boki here, Councilmember Boki here. Anything for us? Your 30-minute presentation, you didn't bring it? Okay, we'll get it next time. Thank you. Any other actions or comments or things we need to address? All right, go ahead and call this meeting adjourned.
Okay.